Hello everyone, I'm the narrator of Night Horror, and I'm here to help you tonight. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable, relax, and enjoy the soothing sound of rain. Haunted burial grounds? It's a no-brainer. As far as encounters with the ghosts of Salem's past, all paths lead to a small two-block path in downtown Salem called Charter Street. Crafted in 1768, this well-trafficked pathway once connected the town wharf and the present-day Market Street. It also boasts the second oldest graveyard in the country, and arguably Salem's most visited. For the record, the oldest maintained cemetery in the United States is the Miles Standish Burial Ground in Duxbury, Massachusetts, dating back to the Pilgrims of 1620. Salem's Old Burying Point, also known as the Charter Street Cemetery, is a familiar location for pop culture representations of the Witch City, serving as a backdrop for paranormal-themed shows like the Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures and Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters. It's also where Salem's dead people go to chill out, especially after Halloween, when this seasonal tourist destination becomes a literal ghost town. Paranormal investigators like Adam Berry from Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters believe the older the cemetery, the more likely it will attract lingering spirits. Cemeteries are where they go to rest and don't want to be bothered, Berry told Ghosts of Salem. I don't believe they're bound or held captive in that specific spot. However, I do feel they're abundant. Berry, who spent hours in old cemeteries armed with an electromagnetic voice phenomenon, EVP recorder, before auditioning for Ghost Hunters Academy and joining the Atlantic Paranormal Society, TAPS, said burial grounds naturally attract paranormal activity. Cemeteries have a lot of activity. The spirits want to talk to you, and they may have a story to pass on, he remarked. As far as Salem's cemeteries, investigator Tina Storer from Paranormal Expedition said the 1692 witch trials hysteria left a psychic imprint of sorts on the area. Something as tragic as the witch trials can definitely attract activity from the mere disrespect that occurred to the bodies after death, she said, adding that the lack of a proper burial for the 19 innocent victims who were hanged at Gallows Hill, and one, Giles Corey, who was pressed to death, could serve as a spirit magnet. However, Salem's creepy burial grounds aren't necessarily the city's most active places. It's easy to think of cemeteries as being haunted. It's a place associated with death. But I don't think it's any different than any other location personally, Storer continued. Spirits are everywhere, and cemeteries are just pinpointing a location to their place of rest. Mike Baker, a scientific-minded paranormal investigator with Para-Boston, echoes Storer's belief. The researcher conducted an exhaustive study for his New England Center for the Advancement of Paranormal Science, NECAPS, on points of geothermal and electromagnetic energy in New England in an attempt to predict active locations. According to Baker, patterns did emerge, including a preponderance of paranormal incidents along fault lines, railroad tracks, and areas where there are higher reports of UFO sightings. However, the study concluded that graveyards were oddly void of activity. We left no stone unturned, even cemeteries, Baker said. We found that there is no correlation to hauntings in cemeteries, which goes against what a lot of people believe. Haunted or not, Salem cemeteries continue to be a hotspot for ghost lore enthusiasts and amateur investigators. In fact, Sarah Frankie Carter, a Salem-based tour guide and featured subject on the History Channel 2's documentary highlighting the city's haunted history, said she stays away from the Howard Street Cemetery after having an alleged encounter with the ominous ghost of Giles Corey. However, this infamous cemetery apparently isn't Salem's most haunted. According to Carter, the most active graveyard is in nearby Peabody. There's one spirit that resides at the St. Mary's Cemetery on Route 114, Carter claimed. I've seen a full-bodied apparition of a woman there 3 different times. She's pretty reliable. I've seen her almost every time I've gone in there. According to multiple reports, visitors at St. Mary's Cemetery in Peabody have spotted faint white lights that move around and experienced a foreboding sensation that one should quickly leave. There are also several EVPs of both male and female voices. Carter claimed she had several close encounters of the paranormal kind with one of St. Mary's resident lady specters. The first time was around 3 a.m. a few years ago, when Carter and her two friends spotted what looked like a plastic bag stuck in a tree. After a second glance, she said it was a female spirit wearing a nightgown. She crawled out of the tree and started running right at us, Carter emotively recalled. It was so dark, but we could see her. She was glowing. We were terrified, and we ran out. Carter's second visit was with a psychic friend who also spotted the female phantom. The spirit was in her 20s, and she died young. I haven't gone back to find her gravestone, but she hangs around a certain spot in the cemetery. The third time that Carter encountered the female specter was with a friend who didn't believe in ghosts. He looks up and sees her, Carter recalled with a laugh. He quickly ran out and refused to go back. Why does so much ghost lore surround Salem's old-school burial grounds? People are fascinated with cemeteries, explained the late, great historian Jim McCabe in a 2007 interview with the Boston Herald. It's like going to a historical house. As far as haunted cemeteries in Salem, the second oldest burial ground in the city is often overlooked. Because of its relative seclusion on Laws Hill, a small mound bordered by Summer, Broad, and Gedney streets, this picturesque cemetery, located a mere stone's throw from the allegedly haunted Salem Inn and the Witch House, is rarely visited by the living. But it's apparently a hotspot for the dead. Why? Broad Street Cemetery was established in 1655 and is the final resting place for Court of Oyer and Terminer Judge Jonathan Corwin, as well as one of Salem's more infamous players from the 1692 witch trials era, Corwin's sadistic nephew, High Sheriff George Corwin. After mysteriously dying from a heart attack at age 30, the younger Corwin was arguably the city's most despised man, and rightfully so. The then 20-something sheriff reportedly got a kick out of torturing the men and women accused of witchcraft. Although it was the uncle, Magistrate Jonathan Corwin, who tried and accused the innocents, it was the sick and twisted nephew who enforced the unjust verdicts. Sheriff Corwin was so disliked by the people of Salem that when he died of a heart attack in 1696, his family didn't dare bury him in the cemetery for fear he'd be dug up and his body torn limb from limb, wrote Robert Ellis Cahill, himself a former Essex County sheriff turned author, in Haunted Happenings. Corwin's cruelty is legendary. For example, he sent an officer to accused witch Mary Parker's home in Andover on September 23, 1692, literally the day after her execution, demanding that her son fork over the dead woman's farm and goods. Parker's son, who was still mourning the loss of his mother, had to cough up a large sum of money to stop Corwin's demands for corn, hay, and cattle. Of course, Corwin is also known as the man who tried to squeeze a confession out of Giles Corey, the elderly landowner who was pressed to death after a torturous 2-day ordeal. "Do you confess?" demanded Corwin, as his men piled more rocks on the stubborn Corey. Corwin reportedly would stand on top of the rocks as the old man demanded more weight. In the crushing, Giles Corey's tongue was pressed out of his mouth, and the sheriff, with his cane, forced it in again, wrote Robert Califf in his account of the torture. According to legend, Corey cursed the sheriff in Salem right before he passed. "Damn you, Sheriff," Corey allegedly cried out. "I curse you in Salem." When Corwin died in 1696, he was a wanted man. Philip English, a wealthy merchant who fled Salem to Boston and ultimately New York with his wife, Mary, after wrongfully being accused, supposedly threatened to place a lien on Corwin's body until his property was returned. For the record, the sheriff's cronies had ransacked English's estate, and English demanded posthumous justice. Corwin was buried beneath his home at the current location of the Joshua Ward House at 148 Washington Street, and was later moved when tempers cooled to the Broad Street Cemetery with his equally disliked uncle, Judge Jonathan Corwin. As far as hauntings, Corwin's final resting place is said to be a lesser-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Floating orbs of light, an indicator of high levels of residual psychic energy, have been spotted in the cemetery. There have been several reports of an apparition of an older gentleman wearing period garb wandering the old-school gravestones. One spirited encounter from 1975 indicates that the Broad Street Cemetery ghost is a whistler. All of a sudden, a glimmer of white caught my eyes, recalled one visitor interviewed by the Boston Globe in October 1975. There, on a grave to the right, was a man's shoulder. The shadow of his head was turning, and out from his mouth came a jagged, high-pitched whistling sound. The freaked-out witness continued, "Something that night didn't want us around Salem. Driving away, we believed that it was Corwin, warning us to leave. Not to deal in forces and intrigues, we were just novices at dot. Is it Sheriff Corwin's spirit? Perhaps. However, the descriptions of the garb of the whistling man's spirit seem to date back to the 18th century. Also, Corwin's spirit is rumored to linger at his former homestead, the land currently occupied by the Joshua Ward house. Meanwhile, it's said that the residual energy of Corwin's uncle supposedly left its imprint at the nearby witch house. One theory suggests that the whistling specter isn't a Corwin, but a man called Jonathan Neal. Broad Street Cemetery is directly across from Salem's picturesque Chestnut Street neighborhood, which continues to be a hub of photo-seeking tourists. The Jonathan Neal house, originally thought to have been built by its namesake in 1767, is now believed to date back to 1652, thanks to the discovery of a deed proving the conversion of a barn on the property 40 years before the Salem witch trials hysteria. Oddly, Neal suffered a freakish death in 1790. The carpenter from Marblehead and grandson of early settler John Neal ran a local waterfront warehouse and, after drinking a few too many in a house of intemperance, fell headfirst into the mud and died tragically. Based on the research of famed paranormal investigators like the late, great Dr. Hans Holzer, it's common for spirits who have died accidentally while intoxicated to stick around. Some believe Neal may be what is known as a stay-behind who lingers in the area surrounding the Broad Street Cemetery near his home. Holzer, in an interview in 2005, explained the phenomenon. Stay-behinds are relatively common, he said. Somebody dies, and then they're really surprised that all of a sudden they're not dead. They're alive like they were. They don't understand it because they weren't prepared for it. So they go back to what they knew most, their chair, their room, and they just sit there. Next, they want to let people know that they're still alive. So they'll do little things like moving things, appear to relatives, pushing objects, poltergeist phenomena, and so on. The odd thing about Neal is that he was known to whistle, and was possibly doing so when he fell face first in the mud that freakishly killed him. Spine-chilling whistles from the afterlife? Yep, it's an attribute of one of the many spirits of Salem hanging out in its historic cemeteries. While it's not Salem's oldest burial ground, Howard Street Cemetery is reportedly its most haunted. Opened next to the old Salem jail, the spooky graveyard on a hill is the final resting spot for seafarer Benjamin Ropes, who was buried there on August 5, 1801. Cause of death? Ropes was fatally crushed while launching the historic ship Belisarius's top mast. Oddly, a large percentage of those buried in the Howard Street Cemetery had a fate similar to Giles Corey, the only witch trial victim who suffered the peine forte et dure form of execution. Yep, a large percentage of those buried there were accidentally or purposefully crushed. We did some research with the city, and we found that a high number of the people buried in the Howard Street Cemetery, around 15%, were crushed to death, explains historian and Salem Night Tour co-owner Tim McGuire. It's so interesting because that was the site where Giles Corey was crushed to death during the witch trials. The Salem Night Tour owner rattled off a series of bizarre accidents of those buried at the Howard Street Cemetery. For example, the floor of the jail collapsed and killed 10 prisoners, he said. A high number of people buried there were crushed to death because of various accidents. McGuire was a featured player on the History Channel 2's documentary focusing on a handful of Salem's alleged haunts. The evidence he unveiled on the show, specifically a photo taken at the Howard Street Cemetery, was shocking. The picture looked like a crowd of Puritan-era revelers, gathered in a lynch mob sort of way, around what is believed to be the exact spot where Corey was stripped naked, placed under a wooden board and crushed to death over a 2-day period in 1692. Someone on my tour took a photo of the cemetery, McGuire said on the History Channel. By the end of the tour, that person came forward to share the photo they took. Definitely not what we were looking at. There seems to be figures of people standing over someone. Most people who feel like they found the spirit of Giles Corey, or have seen his apparition, they think it's a reminder of what we have done to him there. McGuire told Ghosts of Salem that he rarely gives daytime tours. However, a Christian-based group requested an earlier time slot one day, and they snapped the infamous picture. In the photo, you see what looks like flames in the background, and you can make out a couple of faces in the photo, he said, convinced he captured something paranormal. When we were standing there, it was a nice, clear, sunny day. Over the years, McGuire said he's heard of multiple Corey sightings. People often see an old man go around a tree in there. It seems to be the spirit of Giles Corey, he said, adding that the burial ground's proximity to the old Salem jail adds to its negative energy. What's interesting about the Howard Street Cemetery is that it was built to accommodate inmate atrocities. It was the only co-ed jail in the country. Women were on one side, men on the other, and children in the middle. There was a 4-year-old boy who served a 2-month sentence for breaking something. It's common for visitors to report heart palpitations or a sensation of a heavy weight being placed on their upper body, just like the stubborn landowner who had rocks placed on his chest. It's also the norm for Salemites to mention Corey's curse. All of the Essex County sheriffs who overlooked that property eventually died of a heart-related ailment, said McGuire. Robert Cahill, author of Haunted Happenings and sheriff who lived to 70, was a firm believer in the curse. He had a bizarre blood ailment they couldn't diagnose. It's believed that Corey cursed the city and the sheriff in blood, and we have proof. And if someone sees his apparition, Salem allegedly burns. My friend and I were exploring the Howard Street Cemetery, recalled Sarah Frankie Carter on the History Channel. There was a very creepy feeling as we got closer and closer to the spot where Giles Corey was actually pressed to death. My friend wiggled through a fence to see if she could get a closer look at the jail, and I heard her scream. She said she saw a man standing at the top of the stairs. We both had a really bad feeling. Carter echoed the legend that if the skeleton of Corey's ghost in tattered old clothes appears, something horrible will happen to the city. They say if you see Giles Corey, Salem burns. And if he speaks to you, you die, she said, adding that Salem did, in fact, go up in flames after her Corey sighting. I was listening to my local college radio station, and they said there were fires in Salem. Needless to say, I don't go to that part of Salem anymore, especially at night. I don't think he gives you that many chances. Locals believe in Corey's curse. In fact, author Nathaniel Hawthorne claimed that the apparition of the wizard appears as a precursor to some great calamity impending over the community. According to several accounts, Corey's spirit was spotted near the Howard Street Cemetery days before the Great Fire of 1914 that completely annihilated 2/3 of the city. Ironically, the inferno began in Gallows Hill, where 19 innocents were hanged, and the conflagration destroyed 1/3 of Salem. Before the Great Fire of 1914, there were almost 300 accounts of local Salemites who had gone to the sheriff's office and reported this old man in raggedy clothes that they tried to help and then who vanished, confirmed McGuire, adding that he doesn't have solid proof of the lore. They put enough stock into these accounts that the sheriff put deputies around the Howard Street Cemetery. They actually watched that cemetery for 6 or 7 hours, and when they had left, the Great Fire happened about a half hour after. Apparently, Corey's spirit continues to hold the city of Salem accountable. History and mystery oozes from the oldest burial ground in Salem. Also known as the Charter Street Cemetery, the old burying point dates back to 1632, contains the remains of 347 bodies, and is the second oldest cemetery in the country. In addition to its historical relevance, it was a regular haunt for Salem's native son, Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of the classics The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables. Buried in the Charter Street Cemetery is Hawthorne's ancestor, John Hathorne, a witch trial judge whose memory haunted him. In fact, Hawthorne added the W to his name to distance himself from his infamous great-great-grandfather. Yes, the Scarlet Letter writer abhorred his familial connection to the 1692 witch trial's hysteria. At least 8 members of his family were interred there, including his grandparents and 2 of their daughters. Witch trial judge Bartholomew Gedney, poet Anne Bradstreet, Architect carver Samuel McIntyre and Mayflower passenger Richard Moore are all buried there. No surprise, but names from the gravestones in the Charter Street Cemetery often appear in Hawthorne's writings. For example, the small gravestone of Hezekiah Packer, who died in 1684, possibly inspired Hawthorne to use the unusual name of Hephzibah in his novel The House of the Seven Gables. The same novel also features a character called John Swinnerton, who shares his name with a real-life Salem doctor buried in the cemetery in the late 17th century. The cemetery was also featured in Hawthorne's Dr. Grimshaw's Secret Dot. The Salem-bred author met his wife, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, at a lavish dinner party at the Peabody family home located at 53 Charter Street, literally next door to the old burying point. Today it's known as the Grimshaw House. According to lore, Sophia suffered from migraines, and the couple would take midnight strolls in the cemetery. It's believed that the headaches were the result of drugs her father, a Salem dentist, prescribed to her during early childhood to ease her difficulty with teething. The Peabody family lived there between 1835 and 1840 before they moved to Boston. Today, the old burying point lies adjacent to the Witch Trials Memorial, a small park dedicated in 1992 to honor the memory of the men and women who were executed for witchcraft in 692. The Grimshaw House, now in disrepair, stands as an eerie reminder of Salem's 19th century grandeur. As far as paranormal activity, the Charter Street Cemetery is the usual finale for Salem-based ghost tours. Sensitives claim to have an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression walking through the graveyard and the adjoining Witch Trials Memorial. Some believe the area is tied to a disaster. According to lore, a former inn on Charter Street caught on fire, and a woman and her son escaped while her husband remained inside to put out the blaze. They ran back in for him, but he was dead. In the back corner near Murphy's Restaurant and Bar, a woman in a Victorian-era powder blue dress can be seen holding a picnic basket, and a young boy in short pants, black shirt, and hat is always seen with her, reported the website Witch City Ghosts. Often cameras malfunction, but when they do operate properly, the pictures capture bright white streaks of light, paranormal orbs, and odd mists. It's believed that the Victorian-era lady in blue and her son died in the 19th century fire. Apparently, the back corner of the cemetery closest to Murphy's Restaurant is a hotspot for the paranormal. According to legend, a casket once broke through the wall and fell into the building, added Leslie Rule, writing about the restaurant in When the Ghosts Scream. Employees insist it really happened and point to part of the wall that obviously has been patched. No one knows the identity of the ghosts who wander through the restaurant, but some wonder if they may indeed have escaped from the cemetery next door. Tim McGuire, co-owner of the Salem Night Tour, said he's heard stories and has seen convincing photos supporting claims that a casket did indeed break through the wall at Roosevelt's restaurant. It looked like it was a casket of a small child, possibly a girl, he claimed. The corner of the cemetery near Murphy's Restaurant is where the Irish Catholics were buried, so I'm not surprised that it's extremely active. In addition to orbs and full-bodied apparitions spotted in the cemetery, reports suggest that visitors regularly see a lady in white. Oddly, she's rarely captured in photos and film. The cemetery has been the site of the occasional ghostly appearance of a lady in white, wrote Christopher Forrest in North Shore Spirits. The ghost itself does not typically appear in person. Rather, it often manifests itself in the form of orbs. It has even appeared as a slight figure in pictures taken at the site. The lady in white has been spotted in buildings and even in the parking lot near the Charter Street Cemetery. According to a report from North Andover's Eagle Tribune in October 2001, the former owner of Roosevelt's Restaurant, the current spot of Murphy's Restaurant and Bar, said he spotted a female apparition when he was working alone in the restaurant at 3 a.m. I was on the second floor, recalled Henry McGowan. I actually looked up and saw somebody looking down at me. It was a woman. He did a double take, and the phantom vanished. So, who is the lady in white? Within the Witch Trials Memorial, one commemorative stone honors witch trial victims Giles Corey and his wife Martha. However, his second wife, Mary Corey, was also buried in the old burying point. A small white gravestone with the words Mary Corey Sick, wife of Giles, marks her skeletal remains. Historians surmise that Giles was very much in love with his second wife. In fact, she's considered to be the love of his life. Oddly, the lady in white has been seen coming from the general vicinity of her grave marker, and many believe it's her spirit that continues to levitate across the cemetery headed toward the Howard Street Cemetery, in the area where her beloved husband was pressed to death. Based on encounters, Corey's spirit simmers with a post-mortem resentment after being crushed to death under a pile of stones more than 300 years ago. However, if anything has the power to undo the curse unleashed by Corey, it's surely his enduring love for his second wife. Perhaps Mary's spirit is searching for her tortured husband, and if the two spirits finally meet, the curse will be undone. Yes, love exists even in the afterlife. A bald male apparition with a grudge? According to several accounts, the makeshift cemetery in front of St. Peter's Church boasts a motley crew of residual hauntings. This historic house of worship was established in 1733 after the land on which it was built was donated by Philip English, a wealthy man originally from the British Channel Islands. He owned a fleet of 21 ships, several buildings throughout town, and a palatial mansion on Essex Street. English was arguably the richest man in Salem as of 1686, which is probably why he and his wife were accused of practicing the dark arts during the hysteria 6 years later. On Saturday, April 18th, Sheriff George Corwin and his cronies served a warrant for the arrest of Mary English, Philip's wife. The following day, Corwin brought her to the Cat and Wheel, a tavern near the old meeting house, and she was locked in a room on the second floor. Examinations of supposed witches were held at Salem's taverns, so it's no surprise that the local watering hole was used as a more humane holding cell compared to the hell-on-earth dungeon located near Federal Street. Philip was heartbroken and would visit his wife 3 times a day. While Mary was being held prisoner, one of the afflicted girls, Susanna Sheldon, accused Mary's husband of being a witch. She said English stepped over his pew and pinched her during a church service on Sunday, April 24th, in a very sad manner. Sheldon also claimed that English brought her the Devil's Book and forced her to sign it, or he would cut her throat. Weeks before, Sheldon had claimed to have seen Mary's apparition alongside a dark man with a tall hat. Because of his social status, Philip English was sent to Boston. While he was held captive in the neighboring city's more relaxed prison, he arranged for his wife to join him. During their stay in the state's cultural hub, which involved supervised overnight lockdowns, they attended a service at the First Church in Boston. During the sermon, the ministers read Matthew 10:23. When they persecute you in one town, flee to another. English listened. The unfortunate couple maneuvered a prison break and fled to New York in a carriage donated by one of their friends during the witch trials hysteria. Food was scarce in Salem because of a drought, and English, who learned about the horrors happening back home, sent a ship full of corn to feed the suffering. The couple returned to Salem in May 1693 after the governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phipps, issued a general pardon of the remaining accused witches. The Englishes were free, even though they were traumatized by the capricious ordeal. According to lore, English held a lifelong resentment against Judge Hathorne. He was also enraged that Sheriff George Corwin had ransacked his palatial Salem estate on Essex Street, confiscating up to £1,500. After returning to the Witch City, his wife died during childbirth in 1694, and English passed 42 years later, still suffering from lingering resentment and seeking revenge on both the magistrate who accused him of witchcraft and the sheriff who destroyed his property. The 2 makeshift burial grounds in front of St. Peter's Church today boast 23 grave markers. English, whose spirit is rumored to linger in the cemetery, is buried on the church grounds. In fact, his grave is one of only 3 known final resting spots of accused witches in America. Some visitors on Tim McGuire's Salem night tour have captured what appears to be a full-bodied apparition of a man hiding behind the gravestones. Is it English? We've had odd photos coming from the back door of the church. It's funny because it tends to be a bald, modern-looking guy, explained McGuire. It's a common occurrence for a bald guy to show up in photos at St. Peter's Church. Obviously, he isn't a part of the tour. According to other reports, the bald man is seen crouching behind a gravestone as if he's expecting a severe beating. McGuire's Remember Salem gift shop, located at 127 Essex Street, is oddly in the exact spot of one part of English's former mansion, which lies around the corner from St. Peter's Church. The basement of the gift shop, which is the starting point of the Salem Night Tour, is reportedly home to a negative poltergeist known to throw items and yell at people who dare to venture below. There are places in Salem I don't like. Like the basement here, I don't go down there alone, McGuire explained at Remember Salem. I've run into more activity in Salem than anywhere else. Most of my life, I've encountered residual, non-intelligent, non-responsive type of activity. Salem seems to have a lot more intelligent hauntings, and they tend to screw with people here. Some believe the residual energy is possibly tied to English's former homestead on Essex Street. About 4 years ago, we heard a man's voice come over our soundtrack in the store, and he clearly said, "I see you. I watch you," McGuire said. We've had employees and customers see a little girl on the back steps. We've recorded several EVPs, and the little girl is often picked up. She has told us through EVPs that she hides from others. As far as St. Peter's Church, it was originally a wooden building and was rebuilt as a stone structure in 1833. In addition to the ghost lore associated with the bald man, the chapel in the rear of the church was built in 1833, literally on top of part of the cemetery. In fact, the collection of gravestones in front of St. Peter's was moved to various spots, including inside the chapel walls, so the skeletal remains don't necessarily match up with the grave markers. Today, 2 small cemeteries are situated on either side of the church's red front door. Ghostly figures are reported hovering around the area where their old graves are situated. There's also a wooden door salvaged from the original church, and a female spirit wearing shackles is reported to appear emerging from the 18th century structure. Some believe the female specter is Mary English. There are other sightings of male spirits who lean against the cemetery's back wall and watch the living as they escape the crowds marching up and down Essex Street. If English does indeed haunt the land surrounding St. Peter's Church, it may have been triggered by an ironic twist involving the man he reviled most, Judge John Hathorne. 2 of English's granddaughters married Hathorne's grandsons. While English may not haunt the church, it's believed that he continues to turn over in his grave centuries after his death. When it comes to the explicable in Salem, it's not always an open and shut case. People want to find patterns if something doesn't make sense, explained Margaret Press, a Salem-based crime writer and author of Counterpoint, A Murder in Massachusetts Bay. Salem makes it easy for us to find these patterns because of historic accident. It's not in the ground, it's not in the air, it's in ourselves. Press, who penned the essay Salem as Crime Scene in the book Salem, Place, Myth and Memory, talked about how thousands of visitors make a pilgrimage to the city every October looking for the occult, the weird and the unexplained, and they find it. Despite its name, from the Hebrew word for peace, the tourists who flock to the city are convinced the city is about witches and death, Press wrote. They buy mugs and t-shirts and wander the museums, but beneath it all, they're looking and listening. Salem battled him once, but is Satan really gone for good? In Press's world, Salem's emphasis on its specters and spectacles has a downside. We're not training our young people in critical thinking, she told Ghosts of Salem, slamming the city's proliferation of so-called psychics and palm readers. If people accept pseudoscience or crap science, there's a real practical downside. It's no better than 1692. However, Press did coin the phrase known as the Salem factor, which she used to explain the city's abundance of bizarre synchronicities, like how the Great Fire of 1914 oddly started in the exact spot where 19 innocents were hanged for witchcraft. However, the author believes there are rational explanations for the inexplicable. We find coincidences and connections in the human experience here because we expect them, she wrote. We look for the extraordinary in events here and we see it. Press cites the controversy surrounding Fatimas, a 2-decade-old psychic studio in Salem, which made national headlines in 2013 after an employee charged a New York man $16,800 to protect him from a curse, as proof of society's gullibility to Salem's boo business. For the record, the man was reimbursed based on a city ordinance stating that psychics can only forecast the future and read the past. Curses are apparently off-limits. Christian Day, owner of 2 witch-themed shops in Salem, didn't like how a local police detective categorized Fatima's Romani style of fortune-telling as fraudulent. If they're a fraud, then we're all frauds, and all religion is a fraud, Day told the Boston Globe on October 31, 2013. They're not regulating the priest who absolves you of your sins and tells you to put some money in the collection basket, or the old lady who sends all of her money to Pat Robertson. They pick on us for one reason. They're afraid of us. They've always been afraid of us. Oddly, Press herself made similar headlines when she included a section in her book Counterpoint, suggesting that legendary Salem witch Lori Cabot divined the whereabouts of murder victim Martha Brailsford in 1991. The legend supposedly gave a tip to police about the local woman's accused perpetrator, Tom Maimone, and then continued to put a binding spell on him. Lori closed her eyes and pictured Tom Maimone in a white cocoon, bound up in a thread of light, Press wrote. When asked about the section in her book about Cabot, Press shrugged it off. The press picked up on it and made it sound like Lori Cabot cracked the case, Press responded. She didn't. Compared to Press's Agent Scully-esque skepticism, Tim McGuire from the Salem Night Tour is a true believer. McGuire has a more X-Files style explanation for the so-called Salem factor. There's an energy here that's different. I feel it a lot stronger in Salem than, say, Boston, he said. A lot of places like Gettysburg and the Bermuda Triangle, there tends to be electrical issues. Salem has an electrical fault under the city. People who visit here notice that their cell phones drain fast. There are electrical oddities that were noticed by the Native Americans in 1618. They considered it a spiritual place and thought it was odd that Europeans wanted to stay in Salem. McGuire said these electrical anomalies explain why Salem is supposedly a hotbed for the paranormal. The Native Americans talked about seeing things here or feeling a presence here, he continued. When I'm doing a paranormal investigation in Salem, I have to let people know that when they put their meter on the ground, they're going to pick up stuff because Salem has an electrical issue. The Salem factor. Blame it on the electrical issues, or what some call ley lines buried beneath the city's blood-soaked puritanical soil. It's arguably Salem's crime of the century. The murder of Captain Joseph White, an 82-year-old shipmaster and trader, riveted the nation in 1830 and inspired literary giants like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. The crime scene, a 3-story brick mansion built in 1804 and located at 128 Essex Street, is believed to boast a residual haunting, a psychic imprint of sorts replaying the savage murder of White, who was whacked over the head with a 22-inch piece of refurbished hickory, also known as an Indian club, and stabbed 13 times near his heart. According to several reports, a full-bodied apparition peeks out of the second-floor window. A female spirit rumored to be White's niece, Mary Beckford, who served as his housekeeper, in addition to being his next of kin, is also said to haunt the Essex Street house. Beckford's daughter, also a Mary, was formerly part of the household in the 1820s, but moved to Wenham with her husband, Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. Every major city has one, a murder house. In Salem, it's known as the Gardner-Pingree Estate. There were 2 guys from Oregon who came here to debunk things, and they captured on video what seems to be a man looking out of the window, recalled Tim McGuire from the Salem Night Tour. Of all of the places we visit, we get the most photographic evidence from the Gardner-Pingree house. I've been inside the house a few times, and I feel more of a presence of a woman. There's definitely a female presence there. Psychic imprint from the past. Paranormal investigators like Adam Berry from Ghost Hunters believe that residual energy associated with heinous crimes, specifically murders, has potential to leave a supernatural imprint. Anytime there's a traumatic event, it could be left behind, Berry said. If you walk into a room and 2 people have been arguing fiercely, you can feel that weirdness that they've created or energy they emit spewing at each other. I do think there's a form of energy that can be left behind from a traumatic event or any kind of murder or suicide in a room. The theory is that maybe that energy goes into the walls and lingers there. As far as the murder, it's a complicated puzzle that has been twisted over the years. Captain White's grandnephew, Joe Knapp, learned that the retired merchant had just completed his will, leaving $15,000 to Mrs. Beckford. Knapp believed if White died without a will, his mother-in-law would inherit half his fortune of $200,000. So Knapp and his brother John hired a black sheep from the respected Crown and Shield family, Richard, to slay the captain in his sleep for a mere $1,000. Knapp had access to White's Essex Street home, and in April 1830, he stole the will and left the back parlor window unlocked. Beckford and her daughter Mary were staying in Wenham. Crown and Shield slipped into the mansion at night, entering the house, stealthily threaded the staircase, softly opened the chamber door of the sleeping old man. He killed him with a single blow to the left temple, according to an account in the April 1830 edition of the Salem Observer. Crown and Shield hid the murder weapons under the steps at the former Howard Street meeting house. The bludgeon, a hickory stick club, was fashioned to inflict a deadly blow with the least danger of breaking the skin. The handle was contrived as to yield a firm grasp to the hand dot. As far as the crime scene, White was in his bedchamber lying diagonally across the bed on his right side. Blood oozed from the 13 stab wounds, and oddly, no valuables in the house were missing. Because there was no theft, police detectives were baffled at first. The Knapp brothers falsely claimed they had been robbed by 3 men en route to Wenham, which added some initial confusion to the murder mystery. A gang of assassins in Salem? Yes, there were 3, but it was the Knapp brothers and murder-for-hire crony Richard Crown and Shield, who later hanged himself with a handkerchief tied to the bars of his prison cell before he was convicted. The Knapp brothers were then put on trial after the prison suicide. Daniel Webster, giving arguably one of his most famous legal orations, served as the Knapps' prosecutor and called the affair a most extraordinary case and a cool, calculating, money-making murder. The Knapp brothers, admitting they had planned the crime and fabricated the robbery story, were convicted. Meanwhile, it's believed that Edgar Allan Poe was inspired by Webster's speech and penned The Telltale Heart, a classic short story involving the guilt and retribution associated with the grisly murder of an older man. Hawthorne was also entranced by the trial and explored similar themes in The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables. Thousands gathered in downtown Salem to watch their public executions. John Francis Knapp was hanged on September 28, 1830, in front of a blood-soaked haunt from Salem's past. The former witch jail or witch dungeon, currently located at 10 Federal Street. His brother Joe, considered to be the mastermind behind the crime, met a similar fate 3 months later in November. The infamous murder weapon, the custom-made Indian club that measures more than 22 inches, is owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. Unfortunately, the macabre artifact isn't on display today, but visitors can tour the refurbished mansion. According to several reports, the historic murder repeats itself spectrally on the anniversary of Captain White's death. There are also many sightings of a male phantom, believed to be White, gazing out of the second floor of the Gardner Pingree house as the living frolic up and down Essex Street. If White's spirit truly has a calendar, his next scheduled appearance is April 6. As for the city's penchant for historical coincidences, also known as the Salem Factor, the family home of White's murderer, the Crown and Shield Bentley House, was literally moved next to the crime scene in 1959. Yep, the murderer's house was placed next door to the murder house. Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. One tale from the crypt involves a salty sea captain spirit who yells, "Get out of here!" It's this disembodied voice in the dark that spooked the late Robert Ellis Cahill, noted author of Haunted Happenings, and a prolific folklorist responsible for putting a twist on much of Salem's storied ghost lore. When I knew Bob, his thing was about debunking a lot of the supposed hauntings in Salem, recalled John Denley, founder of Fright Times magazine and longtime mastermind behind several haunted houses in Salem, including Witch Mansion on Essex Street. People all over the city called him to check to see if their houses were haunted. However, there was one incident that really messed with him. It creeped him out so much he didn't want to talk about it. The site? A two-story structure built by Sea Captain Herbert Miller from a salvaged barge at Hawthorne Cove Marina near the House of the Seven Gables. During the summer, the marina is the hub of Salem's seaside activity. During the colder months, the location, formerly known as Miller's Wharf, is a virtual graveyard of winterized vessels with boats wrapped in protective tarps. There's also an ominous private property sign and a black dog that protects the two-story structure, which served as a fish food restaurant back in the day. Cahill's friend Mike Purcell purchased the dwelling and said the previous owner recycled the hull of a barge and hoisted it up to create a second floor to what was his summer cottage. The building was rumored to have an odd energy to it, but Purcell couldn't figure out why, so he called Cahill. After some research, it turned out that the hull of the two-story structure was potentially a crime scene of a savagely butchered sea captain. Cahill didn't know much about the location in the 80s before hearing the voice that haunted him for years. It was a disembodied growl that came from nowhere. "Get out of here." Cahill described it as a raspy, gurgling voice, and it spoke to him twice. There was no one else in the room, and the voice had that eerie quality of coming from beyond the grave, wrote Cahill in New England's Ghostly Haunts. "I felt the heat of anxiety flood my face and body, but I didn't move." Cahill was convinced the recycled barge was haunted, but didn't know the history of the building when he published Ghostly Haunts in 1984. He called Herbert Miller's daughter, but she had no clue. It was years later that the barge's possible backstory emerged, and it was more gruesome than Cahill could have imagined. After years of research at the Salem Public Library, Cahill uncovered some shocking history that potentially linked the haunted barge to a horrific murder in 1911. It's speculated that the salvaged vessel was possibly a barge called the Glendower, whose captain, Charles Wyman, was bludgeoned to death with an axe. He was whacked 27 times, according to the February 7th, 1912 edition of the Boston Daily Globe. Captain Wyman was found lying face downward in his bunk. He was dead, reported the Globe. His face and head were covered with cuts and bruises. Bloodstains were on the walls and ceiling of the cabin, although there was no sign of a struggle. Members of the crew, including an old Norwegian deckhand named Bill Nelson, were not covered in blood, and the murder became a whodunit of sorts. An investigation by the Boston police found that William DeGraff, the Glendower's hunchback cook, was possibly the murderer. One crew member testified that DeGraff said that Captain Wyman is no good, and the captain was axed to death at about 2 p.m., right after lunch. Prosecutors didn't have convincing evidence linking DeGraff to the crime, and he was found not guilty thanks to the defense of noted attorney John Feeney. After the trial, the cook disappeared and was never heard from again. However, it's still believed the Dutch hunchback was indeed the culprit. One spine-tingling piece of testimony echoes Cahill's haunted encounter at Miller's Wharf. According to the Glendower's deckhand Nelson, he heard a muffled scream come from the captain's cabin around the time of the murder. Wyman's ominous last words, according to Nelson's testimony: "Get out of here," he recalled. 2 years after the trial, a Philadelphia-based seaman claimed the Wyman murder was revenge. DeGraff had specifically gone to Newburyport from Philadelphia to join the Glendower crew as a cook for the sole purpose of murdering Captain Wyman, said John Breen during an investigation in 1913. Apparently, Wyman had assaulted DeGraff earlier in his career. Wyman had physically flogged a young seaman out of the ship's rigging in a rage, causing him to fall to the deck, crippling him for life, Breen recalled. The seaman was DeGraff. Cahill retold the story of the Glendower in his book, Haunted Ships of the North Atlantic, in 1997. During a public speaking event at Purcell's restaurant, a Salem-based surveyor, responsible for measuring the property around the wharf, approached Cahill and told him he had heard a similar disembodied voice growl those infamous 4 words, "Get out of here." Cahill was convinced. Mystery solved. However, was the Glendower's crime scene hull truly used as Herbert Miller's summer cottage? After doing some research on the Wyman murder, Ghosts of Salem uncovered a series of newspaper clippings from the 1911 murder. There's one shot of jury members from the DeGraff trial wearing turn-of-the-century garb, walking the deck of the ill-fated barge. Oddly, the pilot house does look very similar to the current structure at Hawthorne Cove Marina. The barge, because of its horrid history, never went to sea again, wrote Cahill in Haunted Ships. I think it was the barge that Herbert Miller purchased for pittance, towed to his wharf in Salem some 12 miles away, and winched up to make a second story for his summer home. It is, I believe, the spirit of Captain Charles Wyman that haunts Miller's wharf. His final words, shouted at the hunchback when he entered the captain's cabin with a concealed axe, are forever on his lips. Salem's reportedly haunted correctional facility, which is believed to be the site of an estimated 50 hangings, has a long history of housing human monsters. Its lineup of usual suspects included Albert DeSalvo, more affectionately known as the Boston Strangler, hitman Joseph the Animal Barboza, former mafia underboss Gennaro Angiulo, and Brinks robber Joseph J. Specs O'Keefe. Conditions in the old Salem jail, which has oddly been refurbished into posh apartments, were notoriously horrific. It was a place that didn't have electricity or plumbing, even in the 1960s and 1970s, said Tim McGuire from the Salem Night Tour. Atrocities happened there, more so than executions, and they would kill each other in the prison because the conditions were so unbearable. The granite-walled jail and federal-style keeper's house opened in 1813 next to the Howard Street Cemetery, where Giles Corey was crushed to death in 1692 over a torturous 2-day period. The building was expanded in 1884, at which time its signature Gothic, Victorian, and mosque cupolas were placed on the roof. The building's addition was constructed with Rockport granite salvaged from St. Peter Street, near the exact spot where Corey was pressed to death. Some believe the rocks used to build the jail were soaked with blood from the 1692 witch trials executions. Almost 100 years after its expansion. Conditions were so awful inside, inmates still had to use chamber pots for bathrooms, that a few prisoners successfully sued the county because of its inhumane living conditions. When it closed in 1991 after a 177-year run as a county jail, the Essex County Correctional Institute, or Old Salem Jail, was considered the oldest active penitentiary in the United States. "We've left the dungeon behind us," said Essex County Sheriff Charles H. Reardon at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new facility in Middleton in the 1990s. But did they really? For more than a decade, the 31,630-square-foot jail ominously stood vacant. The boarded-up structure became a popular hotspot for vandals, and its historic facade started to look like a scene pulled from a Stephen King novel. It was during the 90s that the infamous correctional facility near the Howard Street Cemetery became the epicenter of Salem's ghost lore. Based purely on aesthetics. The old Salem jail looked haunted. Many locals would go inside the jail and try to retrieve artifacts left behind, said tour guide Sarah Frankie Clark. It was common for people to see shadow people inside and even outside on the grounds. It was an extremely active location, and people talked about feeling a heaviness in the air. The conditions were really bad there, so I'm not surprised. The riots at the old Salem jail were legendary. In July 1980, 6 inmates turned the facility into a sewer after dumping waste buckets on the floors at the institution. When the prisoners were evacuated from the pre-Civil War facility in '91, they threw food, lit trash cans on fire, and threw urine-filled buckets throughout the jail, reported the Salem Evening News. One inmate wrote "We won" in toothpaste on a table in the prison's rectory. According to another newspaper report on February 21, 1991, the mess included pizza boxes, clothing, and food thrown about the jail. Also, windows and televisions were smashed and several walls kicked in. The building became a magnet for vandals just 1 year after Essex County leaders vowed to give it to the city, reported the Salem Evening News on August 15, 1997. The 185-year-old building had again been vandalized, and some copper piping stolen from it. It became a hangout for thrill-seeking locals during the late 90s. Kids have been getting in there and it's become a party place, said Salem Police Captain Harold Blake in the '97 newspaper report. Someone's going to be liable if anything happens there, and I hope it doesn't fall on the city. As far as spirits, people regularly heard whispers and metal-like sounds echoing throughout the structure when it was abandoned. There was also a residual haunting of what appeared to be a prisoner holding a candle and walking from room to room. On a floor that no longer existed and had collapsed years prior, the jail grounds were extremely active, and several locals claimed to have seen shadow figures and full-bodied apparitions of former prisoners darting across the yard and heading toward the chain-link fence as if they were making their great escape in the afterlife. Civil War soldiers who were imprisoned in the old Salem jail were seen wearing 19th century clothing and moaning in agony from war-related punishments. In fact, several prisoners who spent time at the Essex County Correctional Institute said they shared a cell with long-gone inmates, or residents as they were called in the 80s, from the Civil War era. One explanation for the onslaught of so-called spectral evidence from the abandoned structure was that the living were reportedly coexisting with the dead. Yes, the jail had squatters. People have been living in there for 9 years, said former Public Works Director Stanley Bornstein in the October 15, 1999 edition of the Salem Evening News. You patch one hole, they open another. Whatever you do, you're not going to keep people out of there. Somebody could easily be killed in there. After the infamous penitentiary was turned into upscale condos, and what was the sheriff's office became a popular St. Peter Street restaurant formerly called The Great Escape. And now A and B Salem, the dark shadows from its past, seem to have taken a break. Perhaps their torturous sentence behind bars extended after death, and once the cell blocks were removed and the space was transformed, the correctional facility's invisible prisoners were finally set free. Or the old Salem jail squatters, both the living and their spirited roommates, found a new home.